All right. Yeah, so tiny houses on wheels. I'm assuming you all know that these are not ADUs, but let's talk about this for a minute, because a lot of articles that are on the web will refer to ADUs and have a picture of a tiny house on wheels um, on their article, and the two are talked about in the same breath as though they're the same thing, and they're not at all the same thing. They have almost nothing in common except that they're both smaller than the average American dwelling, which is great. The average American dwelling is 2,600 square feet. These ADUs are far less than that, and tiny houses are far less than ADUs. And so really any kind of different urban infill housing option can effectively achieve the same outcome from a size perspective to some of the concepts we'll be diving into in a little bit here. But I just want to just make sure that everybody gets tiny house on wheels are very cool, but they're not, generally speaking, legal to live in residential zones anywhere in the United States, with a few exceptions. And there's some actually recent changes occurring now where tiny houses are being condoned in residential contexts. For example, in Eugene, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, Placer County, California, Fresno, California, Ojai, California. These are all jurisdictions that are now kind of playing at the edges of actually allowing for the residential habitation of tiny house on wheels on residential properties. Tiny house on wheels, unlike ADUs, are not built to IRC standards. They're not, generally speaking, built with permits. They're not, generally speaking, being done by professional general contractors. They're kind of more of a DIY thing. They're generally speaking very small, 200 square feet or less, and yeah, I mean they're very cool, but they're a totally different animal. They're not easily insurable, financeable, not legal to live in, not legal to rent. Nonetheless, I, as a neutral third-party person, really like them. I think they're great. They're a form of civil disobedience, essentially, though, and so they're not something that the housing kind of institutions necessarily support, or the regulatory and financing elements of housing production really support, but they are a good way to provide infill housing for the homeowner who's interested in having one on their property, even though it's not necessarily condoned by their local jurisdiction. All right, so before we get more into the high performance elements of ADUs, I just wanted to give a little bit of policy context about the regulatory impacts of or regulations on ADUs and the development trends. Portland, as I mentioned, is kind of the leading city in the country for ADU development, which is awesome and also totally pathetic. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. So we had roughly 25 ADUs per year being built from 2000 to 2009. And then that number started to skyrocket and kind of go up exponentially in 2010 to today. And the numbers today are, roughly, it's kind of roughly tabled off at 600 ADUs per year. For some context, we have a population in Portland of 600,000 people. There's 140,000 single-family residential properties. The total number of ADUs built in Portland is 2,900, which is amazing. How many ADUs we built, and it's also completely pathetic that we are the leader in the country, and there's only 2,900 ADUs in a city that has 140,000 single-family homes. That's a 2% market penetration. So I hope that many more jurisdictions will vastly surpass that. But right now, that's where we are in the U.S., and that's largely because the ADU codes in most cities are so bad that nobody in their right mind would want to build one. And we're not going to really focus on that today, but just to kind of give you some context, in Portland, we have, even in well before 2000, we had what most cities struggled to get passed for their ADU code. We had no minimum lot sizes, no parking, no off-street parking requirements. They were allowed by right, no owner occupancy requirements. We allowed any type of ADU. ADUs could be up to 800 square feet. And the impact fees, the system development charges were fairly low. And still, we saw a really pathetically low number of ADUs being built. It wasn't until 2010 when the city waived the system, what are called the system development charges, also known as residential impact fees, that we started to actually see a significant uptick in ADU development in conjunction with myself and a couple other ADU advocates doing a lot of kind of media marketing work to popularize this form of housing. And so that's when we started to see a dramatic kind of uptick in ADU development. And so now it's become a fairly well-known typology of housing. I would say the average homeowner in Portland not only knows what ADUs are, but probably has seriously considered putting one on their property. And I really mean like probably 75% of people, or 50% probably have seriously considered putting an ADU on their property. And I'd say amongst homeowners, probably 80 to 90% of people know what ADUs are, which is really good relative to most jurisdictions, I would say. Most homeowners probably have no clue what the term ADU would mean. And that's because ADUs have been kind of popular for roughly a decade here. And so now it's fairly common in Portland for, a real estate listing, for example, to say, hey, this property has great ADU potential. It's kind of just baked into the discourse amongst realtors, designers, builders, lenders. Everybody knows what ADUs are. Everybody's familiar with them. A lot of homeowners understand that they want ADUs on their property to help offset the increasing mortgage costs associated with housing. On that note, I should mention, in Vancouver, BC has kind of been always ahead, the North Star in terms of the ADU discourse, because they're so far ahead of everybody else. And that's largely because their housing prices are so high. So one of the reasons why ADUs are so popular in Vancouver, BC is because you can't afford a house in Vancouver, BC unless it has an ADU. It's not because ADUs are cool. It's not because they're hip. It's not because they're high performance. It's because you need an ADU on your property to afford the mortgage. And so that's really, ADUs kind of go hand in hand with an affordable housing crisis. And so that's why I said ADUs are going to be taking off largely on the West Coast, then hopefully on the East Coast and other areas where there's a kind of housing market crunch. There's a direct correlation between the need for ADUs and housing unaffordability, for better or worse. I'm not saying we want housing unaffordability, but if you have an affordable housing crisis in your jurisdiction, then ADUs can play a role. If you don't have a housing crisis in your jurisdiction, then ADUs will never take off. So I just kind of giving a little bit of context for the type of situation that ADUs might play a role in. Diving into zoning, in 1927 in Portland, our zoning looked like this. Multifamily here is marked in blue. Residential zoning is marked in yellow. And you can see the multifamily zoning was, probably half of the city of Portland at that point, and the yellow single-family residential was limited to a smaller portion of the city of Portland. And now let's contrast that zoning overlay with the zoning that we have today in Portland. And what you see today in Portland is the vast majority of the city is now covered in yellow single-family residential, and multifamily designations have reduced from 33% of the land area to 10% of the land area. So there's been a dramatic reduction in where you can have multifamily development within our city's land. And I think this is sad because Portland is the epicenter of a metropolitan area. I mean, so this doesn't allow for the type of housing production that we actually need to meet all the kind of population growth and housing unit production that is merited based on the fact that we're a city and a major metropolitan area. Well, it's not major, but we have a population of 2.3 million people in the greater metropolitan area, and the city of Portland I mentioned has roughly 600,000 people. So yet our map is dominated by single-family residential, and guess what? So is yours. Almost every city in the United States is dominated by single-family residential zoning, which is inherently a low density form of development pattern. So over the decades from the early 20s to today, accidentally perhaps, but nonetheless, jurisdictions have kind of relegated more and more higher proportions of their land away from kind of flexible zoning that allowed for multi-unit development to solely and strictly single-family residential housing. And as a result, we see, now that cities are popular again, and now that people are moving into them again, and in conjunction with household sizes shrinking, we're seeing housing costs increased and spike radically in cities like Portland and Seattle and the entire West Coast, the entire East Coast, because our zoning is kind of dictating that we can only put one house for every 5,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet or 20,000 square feet. And and so that's kind of a problem if your goal is to build more housing in cities. And so the one good aspect of zoning in Portland anyway is that all the yellow areas of the map allow for this one additional housing type on all of these properties, and that one additional housing type is an ADU in the backyard or in the basement or whatever. And so there is an escape valve for those economic and kind of demographic pressures for increased housing within the city through this form of housing, ADUs. And in Portland, they've kind of recognized that there is an increased kind of demand and need for additional housing flexibility within residential zones. So now Portland is in the conversation of allowing for not just one ADU, but allowing for 2 ADUs on every property. Initially they were saying, okay, we're going to allow for one attached ADU, one detached ADU. Now the new code is going to allow for up to 2 detached ADUs, and every property, instead of just being allowed to have a single family house, can also have a duplex. And furthermore, this isn't even the latest graphic from the city. The city has now, over the last year, decided, you know what? We're actually going to allow for up to 3 units or even 4 units on every single family residential property. And so there's some very radical kind of transformation in terms of the way that forward-thinking cities are thinking about their residentially zoned areas to enable the type of housing production that our demographics and economics merit. That is to say, more housing units in residential zones that are right-sized for the types of households that we have, which are more 1- and 2-person households. In fact, 2/3 of all of the households in Portland are 1- and 2-person households. And guess what? That's true in your city too. I don't have a graphic on this, but most cities almost every jurisdiction is dominated by 1- and 2-person households at this point. It used to be back in the 1950s, we had a lot of multifamily households, and that was kind of the dominant household typology for single family residential homes, but that's no longer the case. Now what we see are a lot of empty bedrooms in homes occupied, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom homes, 2,500 square foot homes occupied by 1 or 2 people. And from an energy efficiency perspective, that's pretty lame. So kind of being creative about exploring what can be built within those residential zones is a big deal. This conversation is a much bigger conversation that I'm not going to have time to get into, but but now in Portland, they're allowing for up to 4plex. There will be allowing for up to 4plexes, as I mentioned, on single-family residential properties, and now even statewide, Oregon has a House Bill 2001 that is compelling every major city in in Oregon to allow for up to 4plexes in residential zones. So it's not just in Portland, it's in every city, in every major city in Oregon, and in all small cities in Oregon, they're compelling every city to allow for duplexes on all single-family residential property. And it's statewide, there's already an ordinance that says you must allow for ADUs on your property. Those ADUs must not require off-street parking or owner occupancy requirements. So Oregon is kind of really getting ahead now with their thinking about rethinking residential zoning, which I think is all good given the kind of challenges that we're facing from an economic perspective and from a climate perspective. As I mentioned, the kind of the latest proposals are considering allowing for fourplexes, but there's some other changes that are associated with the residential infill project, as it's called locally. So going into kind of the high performance nature of ADUs, this is a study that was put out there by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality back in 2011. They were looking at the life cycle greenhouse gas emission reductions of various different home development techniques, green building methods, compared to the average Oregon home. The average Oregon home was stick-built, 2,262 square feet. And so this study looked at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production, the habitation, and the deconstruction of a building over an average 76-year lifespan. And they found that if you build an advanced framing house, it'll reduce the emissions by roughly 2% or so. Double stud walls would reduce the emissions of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of that home by roughly 8% or so, and SIPs, 7% or so. And these are all great. No problems with any of these things. But the real surprise of this study was that, oh my God, extra small homes just totally blow everything else out of the water. And this extra small home is still significantly bigger than an ADU. So they kind of threw in the small factor as part of their study pretty late in the game. And it was really a surprise that this was something that actually outperformed all the other green building technologies that people think about or were thinking about at the time. And so that was kind of where the study went next, and they started to look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a house in the course of a single year, and in the life cycle of these homes. If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with these homes, it's pretty obvious the bigger homes have more greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. But looking at the the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that home in the course of a single year, if you look at the British thermal units associated with the heating and cooling needs for these homes, that's when things got really interesting. So if you look at the average sized house built to code, the least high performance you could do it in Oregon, that home would use 90 million British thermal units in the course of a year, primarily for heating and cooling. And if that home was built to advanced performance standards, it would use a lot less emissions, and that's great. But simply reducing the size of the structure to the largest ADU you could do, roughly 800 square feet, this ADU built to code, the least high performance home you could build, would outperform that high performance average size house. And this was really when the conversation started to shift in Oregon from thinking about high performance purely on a what kind of heating system you could put in the thing to, wow, we really need to focus on what policy measures we have around housing size. And this is, went hand in hand with Portland's thinking about what do we do with our residential zones to allow for the type of housing production that we need to meet our demographic demands. All of a sudden, you can have your cake and eat it too. We can foster small housing units on residential properties through this ADU code, and hopefully that will help produce high performance homes. And lo and behold, it's working out that way. So and of course, not again, like I'm into green building, and so I always encourage people to consider green building options when they're building an ADU. but I really care more about the fact that they build an ADU, because from my vantage, that's the bigger bang for the buck than anything else. But if you know, if a homeowner is inclined to do so, you can absolutely, you know, reduce the emissions associated with that home by building it to advanced performance standards. Let's look at the, you know, change in household size that I've been alluding to. In the 1940s, we had a lot of these nuclear family households that a lot of our mid-century housing stock was built for. But over time, the household sizes have shrunk quite a bit. So we went from 3.6 to 2.6. And why did this occur? Well, this occurred in part because our household sizes have shrunk. So we have 5+ person households here have shrunk significantly from 1990 to 2014. Meanwhile, 1-person households have just kind of continued to increase, and 2-person households have continued to increase. Let's break that apart a little bit. Why is this happening? Well, number one, we are having fewer children in our people who are choosing to have children are having fewer children, but more and more people are choosing not to have children. So those two things are probably the biggest factor. But there's more people that are, you know, choosing to live without kids, or becoming single parents, or forming households because they are living longer and their kids are out of the house at age 50, and all of a sudden they have half their life left living in a 1 or 2-person household. So as we age, as we live longer than we did previously, that means a greater proportion of our life is going to be spent in a 1 or 2-person household. So there's just like all these factors coalescing are causing our household sizes to shrink overall. And the point here is to say that even if your population is not growing, if it's static, you're still going to need more housing than you needed 50 years ago to meet all of the new households that are in that population that has not grown at all, because of this factor, because we are seeing more and more 1 and 2-person households and fewer 5+ person households. So the question is, you know, how do we create the type of housing that our demographics really merit? The end result of having a shrinking household size and a larger homes being built between 1950 and today is that our average per capita square footprint has gone from this is our single family house size. So our single family house size has increased from 900 square feet or so to roughly 2,600 square feet or so during that same time span. And so if you combine those two factors, the number of people living in a household plus the size of the homes, our square foot per capita has gone from 292 square feet per capita in 1950 to nearly 1,000 square feet per capita in 2013. So this is kind of, if you contrast it to that slide that I had earlier in terms of the kind of the primary energy benefit, or the way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with housing is really to reduce the size of the home. We are going in the wrong direction, people, and this is definitely not a good trend. Certainly high performance homes will help reduce emissions, but we can't really overcome this curve based on the trends that we're seeing with our home size increases and our shrinking household sizes. So this is kind of a critical slide to kind of help understand the direction that we need to be thinking about in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with housing. This research was funded by Oregon Department of Environmental Quality in 2011 or so, and you can find more of the research here on Oregon's website, Green Building website, if you want to look into the greenhouse gas emissions reductions associated with home size. This is kind of foundational research that people interested in building science should be paying attention to. All right, so the second big factor that I wanted to go over today was about the location of homes. A home, the conventional suburban development, the energy associated with the habitation of living in a conventional suburban development is going to be inherently much higher than the habitation of a home built in a transit-oriented development. And this is research from EPA's location efficiency research that shows that, you know, you're not only is your I guess your transportation patterns will be such that it's not so much that you'll be necessarily taking transit to get around, but rather that your vehicle miles traveled will be shorter if you live in a transit-oriented area, because you can get to more places more easily with fewer vehicle miles traveled. And so that if you contrast the the BTUs used by somebody living in a conventional suburban development versus a transit-oriented development, you can see there's a pretty dramatic drop associated with where the home is located itself. And so that is not just something for building science wonks to geek out on, but rather people who exist must pay for their transportation costs. And so this person living in like a really, like a very walkable, bikeable neighborhood will probably have much lower transportation costs in the course of a year than this person living in a conventional suburban development would. And the reason that overlaps with ADUs is because ADUs are going to tend to be built in highly walkable, bikeable areas. This is a map of Portland, and I realize most people probably don't know Portland well enough to know, what is walkable and bikeable, but you can imagine this is kind of the city center here, and this is kind of like the inner city, or any inner, close-in portions of the city. This is where ADUs are being built. And they're being built, there are fewer ADUs being built out here, fewer ADUs being built out here, which are all parts of Portland. But this is where things are very walkable, bikeable, and ADUs will just tend to be built in these highly walkable, bikeable neighborhoods because that is where there is kind of the greatest demand for additional housing units. So without caring at all about climate or greenhouse gas emissions, a homeowner who opts to build an ADU for financial reasons or for housing flexibility reasons or other reasons is most likely, just based on the actual statistics that we have, going to be building that ADU in an area that's pretty walkable, bikeable, and it's going to be regulated. The housing unit itself is going to be regulated to be small. And so without any cognizance of the environmental impacts, they're building this, this very high performance dwelling unit just by virtue of its size and its location. And at least that's the theory of the case. And so that is why I am such a big fan of ADUs, is that without even having to talk about these environmental issues, just really helping homeowners get ADUs built is going to necessarily and intrinsically solve some of these greenhouse gas emission issues that we are all confronting globally. I'm going to just show a few pictures here of high performance ADUs, just to say, yeah, like absolutely there are, above and beyond these kind of big picture issues, size, home size, and location efficiency, ADUs are inherently, or a lot of homeowners who build ADUs do, they're doing new construction, and a good percentage of them, at least in Portland, do care about high performance. And so even without the regulatory requirement to be high performance, some homeowners are going there. In California, where ADUs are becoming very popular, the building codes are very strict, and so a lot of the ADUs that are being built there are going to be high performance because they have to be. And that's really becoming more true in more and more states across the country now. Oregon has pretty strict building codes, so does Washington, and those are the states where ADUs are kind of having the most uptick at the moment. This is another this is a net zero ADU in Portland, solar panels. And then this is the ADU that I built that was high performance, but not net zero or high performance. It was like the not so bad, type of house in terms of it has R33 in the walls, R15 in the slab, R44 in the roof, of, two ACH at 50 pascals of air pressure. I'm a fan of high performance construction for sure. I also just thought just a couple other notes that might be of interest to people in terms of the other things that are getting baked into the cake with ADU production, is that we are seeing more and more ADUs going all electric these days, and that's in large part because ductless mini split is becoming definitely the most dominant solution for HVAC systems within ADUs, primarily for detached ADUs. That is because A, ductless mini split is just becoming more popular, B, because it's very affordable relative to other heating systems. And also they're really good for small homes. They just lend themselves well to small homes. So ductless mini split is becoming definitely the most popular form of heating cooling system, which as many of you might know is a really pretty high performance type of heating cooling system. So again, that's kind of getting baked in now to housing production for ADUs, is that they tend, probably 75% of them or more tend to have ductless mini split as their heating system. And I guess I'm gonna wrap it up there. This is my contact information if you'd like to reach me, and Brad, I'm happy to take any questions that people have at this point. And otherwise, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks for watching. Please continue to watch the next part of the session to complete the course and get your continuing education credits. Be sure to check out all of our courses available online that you can watch anytime and anywhere to pick up your CEUs. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube to get weekly updates and stay up to date on green building science courses, webinars, and home tours. Thanks again.